Maria here from the EditorX team. Welcome to our second session in our series on site structure. Hope you're all having a great week so far. We're just going to give a minute or so for folks to just join us. Welcome to all of you who are coming in. Super happy to have you all. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Just make sure you use the all panelists and attendees function in Zoom so that we can all see what you're saying. That would be great. Welcome. Great. And also, if anybody here has any specific product questions they'd like to ask throughout our webinar, you can use the Q&A box in Zoom, and we'll have someone on our team who's going through those, and we'll answer some throughout live and some at the end live as well. And also a quick thanks to everybody who sent in their questions in advance. Great. Welcome. Welcome to everybody. Great to have you all here. Cool. So if we can move to the next slide, I'll just give you a quick overview of what we'll be covering in the next hour.
By the way, sorry to disturb you, but we just noticed the chat was off. So we are enabling it now. So sorry if you tried to message and introduce yourself and you couldn't, but soon we'll enable the chat again.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for catching that. So in a moment, you'll be able to introduce yourself. But hi again to everybody. Cool. Now I can see everybody coming in. Yay! Great stuff. Hey California. Hey Argentina. Hey UK. Hey the whole world, it seems. Great to have you all. Cool. So I'll just quickly, as we're about to get started, give you an overview of what we'll be covering in the next hour. We're going to be talking a bit about this site structure series itself and how it'll help you learn how to structure and organize responsive sites on EditorX. Thank you very much. And then once we've done that, we'll dive into layouters specifically. It's in the name. And of course, we'll show you the different ways you can use layouters, but we'll also show you the difference between grids and layouters. We covered grids in the previous session, and we'll just give you a recap there. And finally, we'll show you some practical use cases for both tools, and we'll put the knowledge that we learned throughout the session to the test. And at the very end, we'll have some time for Q&A. And just to reiterate, if you do have any questions throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A box now that it's active for your product questions. And if we can move on, thank you. So just to quickly catch you up on what we've covered in the whole series so far, in the first session, we covered grid. You can actually watch that on demand now. It's available on Academy X. Today we'll be covering layouters, as I mentioned, and finally for the third episode in the series we'll be covering repeaters, so stay tuned for details on that as they become available. One question we get a lot: this webinar will be recorded and it'll be sent out to you just as soon as it's ready afterwards. And I think that's basically all the housekeeping. So without any further ado, I'll hand you over to our super talented presenter and product expert, Sebi. Sebi, over to you.
It's muted. Thank you so much, Maria. First of all, I'm very happy to be here and be able to teach you guys about layouters and layouts in general. So let's get this out of the way. So first of all, I like to think about websites as a house, because if you imagine a house that is dirty, messy, it's very hard to find what you're looking for because it's missing the structure and the organization. Versus a clean house where you can find exactly where things are because you labeled it or you put in the right containers. So when you look at a website that's very clean, the same thing, it's very easy to find what you're looking for, and you don't have the issues of people going through the wrong flow. So when you have a messy website, you can see that things are sort of out of place. It's also, hard to look at. So what we're going to be talking about here is we're going to be talking about our containers and how to organize content within these containers and what tools do we have available to organize content. So how is website content organized? So there's two primary ways. You can put things in rows, right? You have things on top of each other, 1, 2, 3, whatever type of content you have, you can obviously stack it on top of each other. You can also put it in columns, right? You can have stuff laid out in 2 columns, 3 columns, 4 columns. And if we were to look at a real design, we would see something like this, where we have, feature 1, feature 2, feature 3, And they all sort of have like this chronological order where we're going from left to right in terms of how it's organized and how the content flows as well. So when we're talking about organization, we're not just talking about columns and rows, we're also talking about which way it's flowing, what's the direction. So in this case, we're flowing the content to the right. And this is what we would call a flexbox layout. For those of you familiar with CSS, this is probably a familiar term, but we are going to talk about it in terms of EditorX as well. Now, take a look at this layout. It's a little bit more complex. There's a lot more going on. We have the image, we have the title, and we also have the features here on the top. If we were to think about this website, you probably would actually divide the website in different areas. So you would have the area of the title, the features area, and then the image area as well. Within the features area, you can even divide it more, right? We can say, okay, each feature will have its own area as well. So basically, this division of areas is actually done by using another type of feature called the grid. The grid allows you to add columns and rows across your section or your container in order to divide them into separate areas. So here we have our area for our title, and then we have our area for our features. And then here we have our area for our image. So even though the image is within several cells, this is something that the grid allows you to do. We actually have a large image area here. So these are the two primary ways to organize your website. You have either it divided into separate areas as a grid, or you can let the content flow in a single direction using a flexbox, or as we call it in the editor, the layouter. So this is basically what we're going to be talking about today, is the layouter. In the grid, we actually covered it in the previous video. So like Maria said, you can catch up on it on the Academy. So just in case you're wondering how the grid works, let's you can watch the video later. So great. So first, let's go ahead and do a live demo. What we're going to actually be recreating is this exact design later on. You can see this is actually built using the layouter. It has several items within this here. We have 4 items. We have the item here on the left, the item here on the right, the item here on the bottom, and the one on here on the right as well. So they do have, remember that we talked about flows, and content flows is columns and rows. In this case, they're sort of wrapping, right? We have this kind of difference in the behavior, but we'll talk about how this works in the layouter. But let's see the responsive behavior. So in resize, we see everything sort of stays in a good order, right? Everything is organized still within this container. And as we get to a certain point, it starts to adapt and change. And then as we continue to scale down, it continues to change and make all these changes as we scale and scale and scale. And this is one of the very powerful things of using a layouter, is that layouter really considers your content as you're designing. And it makes sure that your content, you have a lot of tools to make sure your content is always going to be as best as displayed as possible. So let's go ahead and go into a layouter. First of all, before we start, in order for us to start, we need to add our layouter. So where can we find the layouter? The primary place where you can find the layouter is under Add Elements or Add Panel. You can find it under Quick Add. We have a button right here. We also have layout tools. In layout tools, you can find all our layout tools, including the layouter. Now here we have a few blank type of layouters with some default content as well. You can definitely add them and edit them as much as you want. If you're looking for something that's a little bit more designed, you can go to compositions and find a lot of different layouter based sections as well here. And the cool thing about this is you can add it to your site. You can actually see how they're built. So if you're interested in rebuilding a similar design or the same design and learning how to build it, you can just add it to your site and just, play around with it and learn the values and everything on how it's built. But let's go ahead and add a blank one to start off. So great. So now we have a blank layouter. Now, before we start playing around with it, let's understand what is a layouter made out of. So in order to do this, we're going to go to a layers panel. And you can see here that we have our layouter container here. And interesting thing, if you're familiar with the layers panel, you know that if there's an arrow next to it, then there's children inside or elements inside of it. So inside the layouter, we actually have 3 different containers, or as we call it in terms of the layouter, they're called items. Now, each of these items just works like a regular container. You can add elements to it. You can design them, add a grid to it as well. If you're looking to make things, grid wise, you can do it as well. But it's very important to understand this structure, because when you're adding a layouter, there's multiple layers to it. Now, how do we add an item to this layouter? Well, we can always go to layouter and just click on add item, and then automatically we'll add another item as we had before. And you can see how things will shift in order to add this item. Now, where you can also find where you can manage items under the inspector panel. By going here, you have the option to duplicate the item. If you want to duplicate it, rename, delete, you can even click on add item as well to add another item. Also very important, within the layouter, you'll find that you can play around with different display types, or different views, different ways to display your layout. You can go ahead here and click on rows. You can click on columns. We'll go over each one of the other ones available as we go along. But interesting thing here, if you go back to the inspector, you can see that each different display type will have also different properties, like for example, which direction the content flows, left to right. And you also have the option of setting specific gaps between the elements as well. So great. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start talking a little bit about sizing and how it works in the editor. So in the layouter, we have this specific layouter. I actually added the numbers just so it's a little bit clearer and easier to understand. But we have 1, 2, 3, 4. And as we said, everything flows in a specific direction. Important to note about the layouter is that whenever you're changing the layout type, for example, you have your columns, you change it to rows, the order of the elements are maintained. We can go back to columns and you see that it will go back to 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's very important, and you'll understand the importance as we go along. But let's talk about the sizes here. So we'll go to inspector here, and we can click on each individual item and see the width from the right-hand side. We see here we have the width of 25%, 25%, 25%, 25%. So they're all equally 25%. So if you were to do some quick math, 25% times 4 equals 100%. But I'm going to go ahead and make some changes to the sizes. Now, interesting thing, look at, as I'm editing the size of these other items, look at the other items as well as they change as well. You can see how the other items are also adjusting their sizes. This is 50, this is 50, this is 25, and this is also 25. So great. Now, as you saw, they do adjust, as we added these new values. And this is an important thing to note about the layouter. The layouter is what we would call a content first layout container, basically meaning that the content will adjust and make, and control how the layout behaves and looks. So resizing one element can make other elements also resize. Now let's understand what's the logic here in terms of sizing. Why does it look like this? Well, if you may have noticed, when I was setting values, I did something that is probably not normal, because I put 50% for this, 50% for this, and 25 and 25. So what did I do? I went over 100%. If you're familiar with containers, you would know that content inside of a container cannot be larger than 100%, because 100% means larger than 100% would basically mean that the content will fall outside, or as we call it, overflow outside of the container. But the layouter prevents this overflow behavior. It actually has the logic in order to prevent these issues. And this is what makes layouting and responsiveness so easy. The layouter is all this logic. Now, what is this logic? Basically, it will just proportionally scale things down when they're too large, right? 50% should have been half of the container, but because there's other items here, it resizes and changes its size. You can see if I delete one item, the other items grow and take up that space. So it's important, again, it's a content first layout. So content on the item 1 can influence the content on item 2, and and so on, basically. So it's a very important thing to keep in mind. Now, another thing to note about the item size is also the height of these items, right? Right now we have a specific height. You can see they're all actually set to minimum height none, and we have high auto. We'll talk about high auto in a second, But first, it's very important when you're giving a size, when you're applying the height and width of stuff, to always start from the back, start from the largest parent first, and then work your way in. So if we go here to this layouter, we can see that the height is set to auto as well. And we have a minimum height of 300 pixels. Now, what does this mean? When we have something set to height auto, it means that the content inside will be the size of the height. And here we have the content or the numbers. But we also have a minimum. So it needs to be at least 300 pixels. So because the content is not 300 pixels high, the minimum is taking over the size. So it's 300 pixels. Let's get rid of this minimum, make the height, take the height here. You can see here now the content, you can see how the content now fits perfectly because the item also has height auto, just like the layouter has. And you can see how it's controlled that way. Now, how does the height actually work on a layouter or the items themselves within a row? Well, when I set the height of one item to be greater than other items, the row will automatically grow to the highest or the tallest item that we have. So I have here for the number one, I put 100 pixels. You can see all the other items also grew. Now, what if I go here and say 300 pixels? So now we're back to where we were. Now, why does this even matter, right? Why would I care about adjusting this automatically? Well, let's take a look at the different type of layout that is similar to columns, which we can wrap content around. So in this case, we can go ahead and say, okay, right, we have the content is over 100%, but what if instead of shrinking the content as it surpasses 100%, we want to do something else like, wrap the content around? Well, this is where Mosaic comes around. Mosaic is basically wrapping columns. So we have the elements in columns, but when it surpasses 100%, we'll see how it wraps around. So in this case, we can see that we have item one at the width of 330, and this is item two is width of 60. So altogether they equal 90. If we add the third one, it will surpass 100 because it will be 60 plus 100, but plus 90, which is 150. So this is important to note is when the content wraps, it's because each row can only equal up to 100%. If it's more than 100%, then a new row is created. Great. So now let's go ahead and add a new item to this layouter. Great. So now we have our fifth item in here. Now you'll notice something interesting. If you look at the width of this item, it says 30%. And if you look at the width of this item, it also says 30%. So another rule of the layouter, apart from, the content needs to fill in up to 100%, is that if the content is not 100%, then it will be stretched to fill in that remaining space. There's a different type of layout that will help with that if that's not what you're looking to do. We'll talk about that one later. It's called bricks. But for the Mosaic layout, every row, the content in each row needs to equal up to 100%. So this 30% is technically 100%, even though they're both equal value here. Now, I talked about earlier how important it is because it's a content first layout. So let's understand what this actually means. If I grab this 4 and I put it in between the 1 and 2 and 3, take a look at how the rest of the layout also will adjust. So you can see that the rest of the items made dramatic changes in terms of the sizing and positioning. And this is why we call this a content first, because as you move around content, as content is adjusted, the other content can also be affected. So in general, what I prefer to do when I'm using the layouter is to work one item at a time. Start with the one and move on to the rest as in order. This is the way I prefer to work. Now, great. So we have our items here. Now, what if I wanted to set both items to 50 and 50%? So let's go ahead and set these two to 50 and 50. This is 50, and this one's going to be 50 as well. Now, they're both 50. And as I said before, right, remember how I spoke about how inside of the row, you can't surpass 100%. If it surpasses 100%, it's going to break a line. But 50 plus 50, it does equal 100%. Well, there's actually one more thing that actually affects the size of the row, which is this feature right here called gaps. Gaps will actually add, a small spacing between elements. In this case, we're adding 8 pixels. This 8 pixels is causing this wrapping behavior to happen. If I was to remove this, then you would see that it will automatically pop back to the way it was. So in general, if you're working with gaps, you might need to do, and you want to do this kind of side-by-side design, you actually would not use 50. You would probably use a value that's a bit less, or something like 40 and 40. And then you can have this kind of like split design. So it's important to note this when you're designing, to keep in mind the gaps in order to make sure you have the design as well. Great. So we covered a lot, but now we're actually going to rebuild the design that we showed earlier. So just to show you guys again, this design is, as you may have guessed, it's built using mosaic layout. So we have this wrapping behavior, and we have 4 items. So we're going to have to make sure all their content, as you can see, as it scales down and up, we want to make sure that we're keeping the proper margins and keeping the proper space. We're going to keep on using the mosaic layout until the point of the mobile, and you'll see how the mosaic layout will automatically adjust to fill in the mobile. So the cool thing that you'll notice about the demo is that we'll make small changes in order to make it fully responsive across all breakpoints. And this is where the power comes from the layouter. So let's go through the demo.
Sebi, before you move on, we have a question, if you could help us out. So we got a question here that says, I've been struggling to control the wrapping of layouters responsively. Could you explain how you'd go about controlling the wrapping of the items onto the next line for smaller devices?
So the same idea is you need to keep in mind that the wrapping will happen when the content surpasses 100% of this available space of the container. So you need to keep in mind this. If it's happening on a specific breakpoint where it automatically will wrap around on like mobile because there's less space, most likely what you have is actually a minimum width. You can see here, we have a minimum width of 50. It might be greater because 50 is very small. But if you have a minimum width like 200 pixels, then this wrapping behavior will actually happen on mobile, because you have a limited amount of space typically on mobile. So it's important to check your minimum widths. Don't forget about them. It's very important that you're adjusting them as well. Most of the time when you're adding a layouter, it will come with minimum widths. So most likely this is the issue, is that if you've added it to your site, most likely it came with a minimum width beforehand.
Great, thank you.
And great question, by the way. I never got that question. Great. So let's go ahead and add a layouter in a different way. In this case, I can click on add section and add a layouter. Now, important thing to note about this, as I'm clicking all these options, we're adding 4 items, is that it gets added as a section, but actually remember that a layouter is a container, so that it's another layer. So the layouter itself is not the container. The layouter is actually in a setting called stretch. Basically, it's stretched across the background of our section. So that's why we're able to have that. So I'm gonna just move this up just so it's easier for us to edit, and then I'll stretch it in a moment. So first things first is let's set the value of our widths. So what I want to say here is we want to put 30%. This is 60. Great. So we already are halfway there without doing any work. So there we go. And now we're going to go ahead and also put 30 here. Oh, great. So we have most of it done. Now, in order to save us time, because we're doing a live webinar, we've actually pre-designed some of the content, and we saved it as an asset in a specific library. So in Editor X, you're able to create a design library and share it with the rest of your team, so you guys can collaborate on several projects. For example, here I have my library where I saved all the assets that I need in order to create this design. In order to save a new asset, you can just right-click on any element to select Save as Asset. You name it, you save it to a library, and then you can reuse it with the rest of your team. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and add the content. There we go. We're going to just do a stretch here. Stretching just basically to cover the background of the area. So we're going to continue to stretch our content here. We're just going to add the background first, then we'll add their text. Beautiful backgrounds. So stretch this right here as well. Great. Now I'm going to stretch the container again. just try to click on the layouter. There we go, and click on stretch, cover the background. Great. And I'm also going to shrink this just a bit to make it easier for everyone to see. So great. So we have some stuff in here. Let's go ahead and finalize by adding the rest of the content. So we have some text content here. I'm just going to drag and drop it into place. We're going to put this at 3% from the left. Everything else looks good there. And then lastly, we are going to add our other text content. This is right here. Great. We'll do also 3%. Actually, let's do 4% because I think give a little bit more space from the edge. There we go. And then also need to make sure remember when you're positioning stuff to dock it to the right place, because I was not docked to the right place. That's why I'm saying it. Great. So now we have, the bare bones of our design ready. Now, what are we missing? The height. We need to adjust the height. Again, remember that we can edit the individual height of a row only and not of the entire layouter. For each, we need to go ahead and just edit, one item and then set the height. So in this case, we have a height here. I think it looks like it's fine. We have about 100 here. And then here, it looks like it's a bit problematic. I'm going to go ahead and set another height here. Let's put 300 pixels. There we go. Now it looks a lot better. So great. Now let's resize and see what it looks like. So actually, you may have noticed something that as I'm resizing, before we even resize, there's a bit of an issue, right? Remember how we said that we have the height of an item is always going to be auto. And we also have a minimum height that can, make us, increase the height as well in case we want it to be larger than the content. So I can go ahead and set a minimum height to this row. But what I want to do is actually something different, because there's actually an important part of the feature inside of this text called text scale. You can see here that our text is actually scaling from 40 to 70. So it's changing sizes as we grow and shrink the screen. So if I was to put a fixed height for our row here, let's just say I was to put, 1 second, I was to put, 300, 400 here. You would notice that, the margins on the top and bottom of the text will be constantly changing. If we want to keep a constant margin in this case, because we're using high auto for the container, I'm going to add in the content itself, I'm going to add the margins to the content instead. So we'll go here to this specific text and let's go ahead and say, let's put 25 pixels on top and 25 pixels on the bottom. Now you'll see as I adjust that the 25 pixels, no matter the screen height, the screen width, sorry, we can notice that the margins stay consistent with 25. If we were to put 300, you'll see small changes because the text is shrinking and growing along the way. So great. So this is primarily our design. As we continue to scale, still looks great. You can see everything sort of stays responsive, which is really awesome about the layouter. It took us a few clicks to even do this. And then we sort of get to a point where maybe it doesn't look so great, right? We have content that's being cut off. It's not wrapping like we expect it to because, we want it to wrap, that's the idea. So what do we do in order to prevent this? Well, there's a handy tool that we already actually discussed earlier when I was asked the question, which is called the minimum width. So here we have a minimum width of 50. So what does this mean? Is that we have a width of 60%, but if it reaches 50%, it needs to, 50 pixels, sorry, then it needs to wrap. In this case, it's only 50, so 50 is probably not enough. We need to find the proper value. Well, there's a trick in Editor X in order to calculate the current size and set it as the value of the minimum width. And basically, in this case, I want this is going to be the smallest size of my item. Other than this, I don't want it smaller. So I can just get rid of this value here. Let's set it back to 0. And then I can click again on pixels. And then you can see automatically calculates the current size, which is 397. And then as I resize here, you can see that the wrapping behavior will automatically happen. Now, what else happened now? Well, we don't have the content holding the height. Remember that when you have two items side by side, the item with the highest height will affect the item on the same row. In this case, the item on the same row doesn't have the same height as it had before because it changed. So we can make a simple change here. We can say, okay, let's set this as 300 pixels, minimum height, and that's it. And now we're down to these two. So we have again, as we wrap around,
sorry to interrupt you again.
Yes.
But we do have a question that was relevant before you move on. So it's a pretty general question, but very important. When should I opt for a layouter versus a regular grid? Like, what can the layouter do that the grid can't?
I think this is a great question for what will come after the demo.
Sure.
So we'll cover that. And if it's still not clear, please ask us again and we'll make sure to further elaborate. But it's a great question because it's a challenge in some cases.
Great.
Okay, great. So as we continue to scale, we can see that we have the wrapping behavior here, but then we don't have any wrapping behavior here. So let's go ahead and make some changes here. So how can we make this wrap? Well, let's do the same thing. I want to make sure that this does not become smaller than 300 pixels. So you can see. And then we have the wrapping behavior. So as we scale down, we can see that we have this. Now, last thing, what I'm missing is that now the height of this one changed, because remember, before I said the minimum height only of this item. We can definitely set the minimum height again of the item, but there's another thing we can also do, which I actually showed earlier, because the height of the items is, oh, excuse me. I think I accidentally click undo. 1 second. Where is this? Oh no, it was this item. Just trying to make sure. Yes, I did click undo. Okay, there we go. So you can see here how it's wrapping around. Now, last thing, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add some margins here. Let's add our 50 pixel margin on the top. So now we have a bit of a margin. Actually, maybe it should have been 100. I miscalculated this. So let's put 100 here. There we go. Great. And interesting thing, as you may have noticed, take a look at what breakpoint I'm in as I'm resizing here. I'm on mobile, right? And mobile, we have this when we have a wider mobile device looking at this. As we scale down, we start to see changes in our layout. We start to see these two change, and then eventually the one on top changes. So this is a very important thing to note about the layouter. This specific behavior, especially since we got the question about the layouter versus grid, this is one behavior that's only possible to do in the layouter. The layouter allows you to make changes within the same breakpoint, because the layouter, again, is content first. So as the content needs to, adapt because it's going to become too small, it will automatically move to another row and, make these changes here. So this is why one of the differences between grid and layouter, and we'll talk about a few more soon. So great, that's our layout. Lastly, since we covered the mosaic layout, there's a few other layouts for us to cover. So let's go ahead and talk about the slides layout. Now, here we have a layouter laid out as columns, right? When we're thinking about a layout on desktop, we have a lot more space, right? It's not so narrow, but when we get down to mobile, we sort of can run out of space. So in the layout, you would see that as we scale down, we actually changed our layout. We have slides actually selected. I'm going to actually select slider for 1 second. Sorry if it confuses anyone, but basically we can create a different type of container, basically the same, different type of layout within the same container between different breakpoints, right? We have here columns, and then on mobile, I want to display everything as a slider. Now, what is a slider? Well, a slider allows you to lay out the content inside of a scrolling container. So you can see that as I scroll, we would reveal the rest of the content. So it's a really great layout. Now, what if I wanted, the scrolling behavior is great, right? You're using your thumb, but in some cases you might want to create a different type of navigation, maybe navigation where they can click to go to the next slide, sort of like a slideshow. This is where slides comes into play. So in slides, you can see here in the display settings, we have this option of adding a navigation. We can click here on add, And we have the option here of having arrows, buttons, and text. So I can go ahead and just say, okay, let me add some arrows. It will automatically add the arrows to my design. I can move them around actually. So this is really great. You can move them around. You can even change the shape. If you're creating vector arts, you have something that custom arrow that you want to use, you can definitely use them. You can put them outside of the actual container and play around with them. And you can even see, I also have buttons as well. So you can have multiple different types of navigations. So you can see here, if I click on this, it will move around. Even though it's a bit ugly, it works always. So you can see how it's a really great experience you can create within the layouter, because you have a specific layout on desktop and then on mobile where it's a little bit more narrow. You can create this kind of behavior where the rest of the content is revealed as you scroll. Now, what if you were to put it in a real use case? Well, this specific design actually is available to you from the composition. So for those of you that are interested in seeing it later, you can find it. But this layout actually is created also using the layouter. And as you may have guessed, is using Mosaic. Now, interesting thing is, how it talked about the height of the items needs to be the same. It kind of sort of looks different height, these items, right? We have item 1 and item 2. Now, they sort of look different, but they're actually the same height. The only difference is they have padding or margins you can also add depending on whatever you want to use to create this sort of spacing between the image and the edge of the item itself. And you can see here, it's the opposite. The top is the spacing. So that's how they created this behavior. Now, as we scroll down all the way, we get smaller and smaller and smaller. Eventually, it's small enough where it's better to just have a scrolling container to reveal the rest of the content. Because remember, this is images. We want it to be nice, big, and beautiful. So this is why this behavior is very useful. Okay, so that's the slides. Let's go move on to another layout called the bricks. Now, we talked about the mosaic layout, how whenever something surpasses 100% of the available space inside of the row, it will create a new row underneath. And also, it will have the second rule is that it will actually stretch the elements to fill in the remaining space, right? We have this item here that is 60%, and this other item is 30%, they equal 90%. We have a 10% left over. So what happens here? They're being stretched. What if you don't want them to stretch? What if you want them to stay the size that you set? Well, there is another option to do this, is by using what we call the layouter. Sorry, not the layouter. What we call the bricks layouter type. So you can see here we have bricks. If I switch to it, you can see that we have our width set to 40% of this item. And this one is set to 50%. So again, we're missing that 10%, but that 10% is not added to the items. It's actually still just blank space. The same thing for 3 and 4 here. They're also in their own row. Now, just to take a look here at the behavior as we scale down, you would see, 1 second, scale down. Oh, well, maybe it's a bad, I'm missing a setting here. I need to set a minimum width. I actually want to show some specific behavior. So let's go ahead and just put 300 pixels here as a minimum width. So let's do that. And you would see how it has this wrapping behavior. So this wrapping behavior that happens as we scale down. So similar to the mosaic layout, just the difference is that it's not really stretching. Also, apart from this, within the bricks, you have a little bit more control as far as how the spacing is divided. Because we have this extra spacing now, we can decide on how it's laid out within our content. We can have the content start from the left, and then you have the spacing on the right. You can have the content in the center, and the spacing is on the sides. You have the content start from the right, and then the content's on the left. And you can even have the space be divided in between, or the space around the objects as well. So there's a lot of different options as far as how this space is used up in this case. Now, in a real use case, you might find a design like this, where we have a lot of, let's just click on it to scale down. So as we scale down, you would see how the items here will automatically move down. You can see how they all kind of wrap around. So it's very common to see this type of feature being used for these type of layouts where, content needs to adjust and you don't want to stretch when it adjusts to the new row. You want to keep its size. Also interesting thing about this layout you may have seen is that actually it's built using a grid on the outside, right? We have a grid building the section design itself. Inside the grid, we have the layouter. So it's important to also keep in mind that, when you think about layout versus grid, sometimes it's a combination of both that gets you the layout that you want to do. It's not always choosing one or the other. You can put one inside of another. You can put a grid inside of a layouter as well. You can go inside of these items and say, you can apply a grid here to each individual item in order to also change how the layout behaves. Great, so that is our demo of the layouter. So let's go back to our presentation here and talk a little bit about grid versus layouter. So it goes back to our previous question. So grid versus layouter, when should you use each tool? So in general, grid is a more precise tool, right? It has a lot more options in terms of how you size things. And also it's more precise in general. The sizes of elements stays a little bit more consistent. So in general, it helps you build more complex layouts. When you see layouts on layouter, they tend to be a little bit more simple, single directional, which means that it's either going left to right, or it could be a wrapping columns as well. But in general, they seem to be a little bit more simple because you do have less control over the size of the items because they can stretch, they can be moved to another row. You have a little bit less control over that. Also very important as a layouter, as you saw, is they have this behavior where the columns will wrap around within the same breakpoint, or these items can change within the same breakpoint. And in the grid, you can't really do this, and we'll see an example very soon. Also, another thing about the grid is that elements can overlap multiple cells. In the layouter, because each item is sort of like individualized and it can move on to another row, sometimes you don't want content to be overlapping between two different items, because then one item will move underneath and the other item will keep the overlapping element there, and it's kind of weird. So this is something to keep in mind with the layouter. Now, we have this layout here. Which tool would I use? So in general, just looking at this layout, it's a pretty complex layout, right? We have a lot of different ways of this content is organized. It's fully responsive, but it is complex. We also have overlaying items, right? Items are laid on top of another item. So this makes it a bit more complex even. So what tool would I actually use? Well, in this case, I would use a grid. Why? Because a grid will allow us to create these fine lines between each item, right? And make it easy for us to lay out the content. If we're thinking about a layouter, the items need to be the same height in the same row. But here you can see the items have different heights. So it could be really complex to build this layout in the layouter. So I would recommend when you're building a layout like this, use a grid because it's more complex. In this layout, we have a different type of layout where we have sort of like this division of the two sides, right? We have the side on the left and the side on the right. So if you're imagining it as a layouter, you can have a layouter, dividing both areas. So you have item 1 on the left and item 2 on the right. You can even consider each text here have its own item as well. We have a layouter here where the first item, the first item is stretched to 100%, and the other two are divided between 50-50. Actually, if you remember, margins would affect this. So 50-50 would probably not be the right value to use. Maybe you can use 40-40 or something else. So I would use a layouter for this because you remember, layouter is a lot simpler to set up. When you're using a grid, it can take a little bit more time because you're being more precise with the values. So when a simple layout, I think layouter can do just the job. Now it's your guys' turn. And what we're going to do is we're going to share a poll with you, and we're going to give you a design. And you're going to have to tell us which tool do you think it's best to use to build this specific design, either the grid, the layouter, or both. And let's go ahead and try out this design. Now, keep in mind about this design is that we have several different tags here, right? A tag for each individual city, we can say. And we want to keep these tags in a specific size. And as we shrink down, we want to make sure that they sort of have a wrapping behavior, because this is, the tags needs to always be clickable in this way. So go ahead and select whichever you think you would use. And in a moment, we'll reveal the results and I'll tell you the real answer. Okay, just waiting for a few more people to answer. All right, so I do see some people in the chat giving away answers.
Yeah, spoilers in the chat.
Yes, come on, guys. We need to use the quiz. Great. So let's see the results. Okay, so we have 68% say layouter, 21% say grid, and some about 11% say both. So let's see what it is. Well, it's a layouter. Well, this is mostly because of the responsive properties. And let's just take a look here at the responsive properties of this specific layout. Now, I know it could have been a bit challenging because we just showed a design and not the full responsive properties, but you need to use your imagination a bit because remember, when you're designing a site, you're given a design asset or you're drawing on a paper and you need to visualize and mentalize kind of what responsive behavior you want. But here you can see that when we get to this point, it sort of wraps around. In a grid, you can't really do this within the same breakpoint. Remember, so the grid was, within the same breakpoint, it keeps the lines. So in this layout, the best tool to use is a layouter because of this. And does anyone want to use the chat maybe to ask, to answer which type of layout type you would use in the layouter? Great. So I see Gary says brick, and that is correct. It is actually the brick. Mosaic. Mosaic you can definitely use for these type of layouts, but keep in mind that if you use Mosaic, it will actually have a different behavior. I'm just going to change it to Mosaic just so everyone can visualize. When I change it to Mosaic, the elements will be stretched, right? Remember that Mosaic will stretch the elements when they don't fill in the space. So sometimes for these specific layout, it's better to use, oops, I went back. I meant to do undo. So for these specific layouts, because you want to have a specific size for this element, you don't want it to stretch because when it's stretched, right, doesn't look so great because Berlin is shorter than Rio de Janeiro and Amsterdam. So you want to have a specific size. So bricks is a little bit better because it gives you a bit more control over the size here. Great. So let's move on to the next one. So this design, very similar to what we were doing before. What would you use for this specific layout? Okay, just taking a few more replies. And thank you guys, everyone that's participating in the poll. It's really great to see everyone so engaged in this webinar. Okay, so let's see the results. All right, so it's a little bit I think everyone is right here in some ways. But basically we have our layouter at 35% of the audience. We have 45% of the replies at grid and 20% say both. Now everyone's technically right, but the writer answer, if that's even English, actually not everyone's right. Actually the grid I did make a mistake. I made a mistake. I apologize. It's actually the grid. And I'll explain to you guys why it's the grid. I sort of jumped to the next anyways. Let's ignore whatever I just said. We're just going to stick to using the grid for this specific layout. Great. So this layout, very similar to what we were doing before. We have the 4 items. Actually, it's the same exact items as what we had before, but they're just laid out a little bit different. But in this specific layout, right, if we're using a layouter, how are we going to use mosaic? Because mosaic layout, remember that each row, the items in the row needs to equal the same height. So even if we had, right, if the height, let's just say we had a different height and we're using margins, we still have this overlap here of the row below. Having overlap between rows is very bad and very hard to manage within the layouter. So the best tool to use here is actually a grid. And you can see here the divisions. Remember how we talked about briefly before about the grid, how you create different areas. So sort of we have the same thing here. We have a 2-cell area for this item, 1-cell area here. You have another area here and another area here. If you're not super familiar with the grid, it's definitely okay. Remember, we have another webinar that we did previously. You can find it on the Academy and watch it. But this particular layout is better for the grid because of this. Now I see there's a question that someone sent to us that says overflow or overlap. So I'll maybe sometimes I speak very fast. But I'll say, so basically it's overlapping content. Overflowing content also is technically hard to do on the layouter, right? Remember how we said that when you're using mosaic, the content will wrap around as you reach 100%, if you surpass 100%. Also, you can do overlapping content in general, because remember that if you have, let's just open a really quick, I just want to go back to this design. And I'm just going to add, let's just add an image here just so everyone can kind of understand the complexity of this specific issue with having content overlapping. Maybe we'll do 1 second. I'm just going to do a little change here where I'm going to make sure this item is on the front. So I'm just going to click here and select align to arrange to front. There we go. So now you can see this image is overlapping. What's going to happen here? Well, as we resize, the image is overlapping, but it's overlapping from this item, remember. So as we continue to scale down, eventually the image actually moves location, right? Because before it was overlapping these 2 cells, now it's overlapping 1. So you can see how it can get really complicated to work with these. So great. Moving on to the next one. What would we use for this specific design? A grid or a layouter? Let's answer the poll. I do see that some questions are still coming to the chat. You can also ask in the Q&A box on the bottom. That way it's a little bit easier because Maria will have a short Q&A now as well. And Maria will be able to share with me some of the questions we see there. So it's easier to put them there because in the chat, they can get lost a bit. I want to make sure we all get our answers.
To be fair, one of the questions was, is this another trick question? So I think that's a lot.
So there's no trick questions. It's just I got tricked by myself because I created this. Yes, so I can trick myself sometimes too. Great. So grid or layouter. Let's see the results. So we have layouter 62%, grid 12%, and both is 26. So we see that both kind of became a little bit more now, and that is actually true. We can use both for these. It depends on what responsive behavior you want. The layout itself can be built using either tool. Let's see what we mean here. Oh, and I'm still on my mobile, so let's actually go back to desktop. So you can see here, this specific design is actually built using the layouter, and this design is built using the grid. You can see they're the same, they're pretty similar, everything looks pretty much the same, but you notice some difference when we scale down. As we scale down, we see that this starts to get very small here. Oh, sorry, I was on the wrong design. As we see here, oh, let's scroll back up. There we go. As we see here and we scroll down, we would see that there's a wrapping behavior here, right? Because the contact us item sort of becomes too small. and then you need to kind of wrap it around to make it, adjust and still legible. But on the grid, we can't make this change within the same breakpoint. We're still on the desktop, but we made this change. So this is one of the main differences between building both, but you can see that they both started with the same layout. Even as we break down to the next breakpoint, you can see that when we get to desktop, oh, excuse me, I'm on desktop still. But if we go to tablet, you can see they're both the same. If we go to mobile, they're also both the same. So the main difference here is, remember that within the same breakpoint, I can make this kind of wrapping behavior. Now, also on the grid, you can set a minimum as well, but it's not the same behavior as you would see here. Great. So this actually concludes our webinar, but we will take some questions from the audience. So Maria, take it away.
Yeah, sure. We got lots, so I'm not sure we're going to have time for all of them. But if you do want to ask us any questions, maybe after the webinar, you can email us at hi@editorx.com. But I'll get through as many as I can. So the first one, Sebi, is what if your content is already in the EditorX UI and you want to add your existing content to a layouter?
This is a great question. Well,
Yeah.
actually, you can do this on the fly. You can drag and drop any container into a layouter. I showed earlier dragging and dropping content, but not specific content from outside. I'm gonna add something from compositions. It's not actually part of the design that we have here, but I'm just gonna drag and drop this, and just to show you guys how it behaves, you can see how I can add it, and it actually shows me like the line between the items. So if I drop it here, it automatically becomes part of the layout. And now it's an item within the layout. So any type of container, you can drag and drop it into there, and then it will automatically become a new item of the layouter.
Cool. Simple as that. That's great. So the next one we have is, can you include dynamic things in a layouter? Like the example they gave was from MySQL.
So dynamic content connecting to database, you can definitely connect to database. We actually have in EditorX, we have what we call a content manager, where you can create a table with data and store it, and you can have images, all different types of files and different types of data. And you can connect it to your specific elements on the layouter as well. So you can, manage your content and data that way. There's also a different type of tool called the repeaters. That's very similar to a layouter. It's sort of a combination of both in terms of layouting. You have both the grid and the layouter properties similar. But the main difference is that repeater is basically a repeating design with different content. So you can connect a design. Let's say, like, for example, in the layout that I had earlier, let's see here. The layout that I had earlier, not this design. I keep on jumping to the wrong one. Slides, there we go. Where we have the projects, if this was using a repeater, then we can connect the data to the content manager from the content manager to here. If you have external data, you can also import it using code, using the dev mode code. You can import your data that way as well, using the relevant tools.
Yeah, it's a great answer. We got a follow up there that was, how do I import the external data? So you predicted it. Perfect. Just to mention as well, we'll have a dedicated webinar about repeaters that Sebi just mentioned in the future. So stay tuned if you're interested in that as well. Okay, so we have another one here that says, is the text within a layouter findable by Google? Like, is it indexable by Google?
100%, yes, it can be indexed by Google.
Yeah, it's the same as text elements kind of anywhere on an EditorX site, right? Okay, cool. Let me just see. They're coming in a lot here. 1 second. This is a question that comes up a bit as well. And maybe it might be the last one we have time for, but margins versus padding, what determines which to use?
Okay, so margins versus padding, they both sort of work very similar, and they can both sort of be interchangeable in many designs. As you can see here, in this layouter item, we're actually using what we call padding. Now, padding, for those of you that don't know, padding goes inside of a container and between the content and the borders of the container, and margins go on the outside of the container. If we were to visualize it here, you can see we have a padding of 80 pixels on the container itself. So the container itself is pushing the content inside of it down 80 pixels. Now, what is the major difference? Well, we have this image here, right? Let's click here. If I stretch this image, it can't cover that padding area because the padding area is being, preventing it from being stretched. If I go ahead and remove this top padding from the container, you'll see that now the image that is stretched is fully stretched. When using margins, you can do the same exact layout because I can go ahead and have this image stretched and say, let's add 80 pixels. And you can see it looks exactly the same. Now, when does it become different? Well, imagine that you also have content, right? For example, here, we have a layout where the padding is pushing both the image and the text up. If we get rid of this padding here, you can see that now if I add margins to this image, let's just add stretch the image, and oops, actually I didn't want to stretch it because I know collapse, but let's go ahead and actually add some margins to the bottom. So let's do 80 pixels to the bottom. You can see the difference now is that the text itself also will be on this because the text is not, it's not being pushed by the paddings anymore. So now I need to also add some margins, additional margins to the text in order to move it to its proper place. So they're both very similar. They both sort of have very similar things. Padding can only be added to containers. And generally, if you need to stretch an image on a background, you need to use margins on the content inside. But apart from that, they're all the same. They're very similar in how they're used.
I think we'll try and squeeze in two very, very final questions, Debbie. Is it possible to add another layouter to an existing layouter? So like a meta layouter, if you will.
Yes, it is possible to add one inside of another. And you can really create really powerful layouts this way as well.
Cool. And then this one is the layouter height looks smaller on big screens. How do I avoid it so it look consistent on bigger screens, I guess is the question.
So the layouter height looks smaller on bigger screens.
Yeah.
So keep in mind, remember how we talked about that the height is managed by auto. You have an auto height, but you also have a minimum height as well. You can play around with these values. Maybe you need to use a different unit type. Maybe pixels is not the right one. If you're trying to go for something particular, maybe you can say, if you want it to be 100% of the height of the screen, you can set to 100 VH, which is 100% of the screen. So you can use different units. If the height of, the proportion of the height is wrong, then most likely viewport height might be a better option. You can also use percentage as well, which is like a responsive unit, a relative unit that adjusts as the screen size grows and shrinks. So you can see how it also, as the section grows and shrinks as well. So it really depends on how it's built. If you have specific design that you have a question about, you can take a screenshot and share it to hi@editorx.com. That's hi@editorx.com, and we can answer from there as well.
Great. That's kind of all the questions we have time for, but thank you so much, Sebi. That was so fascinating, and thank you everybody for being so engaged, for participating in the polls and everything, and asking all those great questions. Like I mentioned, you can join us for the next session where we'll be talking about repeaters on EditorX, and that'll be the final kind of chapter in our site layouting series. And we'll be sharing details about that soon. As Sebi said, if there's anything we didn't get a chance to answer, you can contact us at hi@editorx.com. If you want to check out that video about grid, you can go to our academy. That's editorx.com/academy. And if you want, you can get in touch with us anytime you want at editorxcommunity.com. That's all for us. And thank you so much to everybody again, and have a great week. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great week.
Bye.